Well, it's good to see everyone here this evening. We'll be continuing our study in Galatians. We'll be covering Chapter 2 tonight. We'll start out by determining what the objectives are in studying this chapter, and go through the summary and outline of the chapter by verses, and then some questions and answers after we finish that. Beginning with the outline, the objectives in studying this chapter. One objective is to understand why Paul would refuse to circumcise Titus, but then he had Timothy circumcised later, as recorded in Acts 16:1-3. Another objective is to appreciate why it is necessary for Paul to rebuke Peter to his face. And a third objective is to understand why, if righteousness comes by law, then Christ's death was in vain. Okay, we'll go through the summary. And this chapter starts with Paul continuing to defend his apostleship. He describes a meeting in Jerusalem 14 years after the one with Peter, related in chapter 1. It was prompted by a revelation, and Barnabas and Titus went with him to meet those who were of reputation. The meeting was private, but some false brethren were secretly brought in, who sought to demand that Titus, a Gentile, be circumcised. Paul refused, viewing it as an effort to bring back into bondage from which Christ had set them free. That's verses 1-5. Next, as a result of the meeting, there were those who seemed to be something, added nothing to Paul. In fact, once they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised had been given to him, just as the gospel of the circumcised had been given to Peter. And once James, Cephas, and John perceived that the grace they had been given to Paul, he was extended the right hand of fellowship. They only asked that Paul be mindful of the poor, something he was very eager to do. This is verses 6-10. Then next, the rest of the chapter describes a confrontation in Antioch between Peter and Paul. Peter, who was visiting, at first was willing to eat with the Gentiles, but when some came from James, out of fear, he withdrew himself. Through his influence, the rest of the Jews, even Barnabas, were carried away into hypocrisy. This prompted Paul to withstand Peter to his face, and to so rebuke him as in the presence of all. In the course of his rebuke, Paul stressed that we are justified by faith in Christ, and not by the works of law. Otherwise, Christ would have died in vain. So that's a general summary of the chapter. We'll go on to a discussion, an outline discussion of the entire chapter. And it starts out with the meeting in Jerusalem. It was in private with those of reputation, and this is verses 1-5 we're covering, occurring 14 years later, accompanied by Barnabas and Titus. Spurred to go by revelation, he communicated the gospel he had preached, refused to allow Tim to be circumcised, and some brethren desired who were secretly brought into the meeting. Next, by his sanction, James, Cephas, and John. That's 6-10. Okay, those who seemed to be something, reputation really made no difference, did not add anything to Paul. When those of the reputation saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised had been committed to Paul, just as the gospel of the circumcised was to Peter, that James, Cephas, and John perceived the grace given to Paul, they would extend the right hand of fellowship to Paul and Barnabas. They only asked that the poor be remembered, something Paul was very eager to do. Okay, next is the confrontation at Antioch between him and Peter. Now, first it deals with Peter's hypocrisy, 11 through 13. Paul had to withstand Peter face to face because he would not eat with Gentiles when those from James came to Antioch. Peter's example of hypocrisy influenced other Jews, even Barnabas. Next we have Paul's rebuke to Peter. First we deal with Peter's hypocrisy. He himself, though Jewish, lived as a Gentile, yet he was compelling Gentiles to live as Jews. A summary of Paul's rebuke, it goes this way. Jewish Christians realized that they were justified by faith in Christ and not by the words of the law, by which no flesh can be justified. If I seek to be justified by Christ through a means which I cannot justify, isn't that making Christ a minister of sin? If I rebuild that which cannot justify and have been destroyed, for example, the law, won't I become a transgressor again? Through the law, I have died to the law. Having been crucified with Christ, Christ now lives in me, and the life I now live to God is a life of faith in the Son of God. If righteousness comes through the law, Christ actually died in vain, and the grace of God has been set outside. So that's chapter 2. We'll go into some questions and the answers to them and wrap up this chapter. So, first question is, what are the main points of this chapter? 2 main points, the meeting at Jerusalem and the confrontation at Antioch. How long was it before Paul returned to Jerusalem? Who went with him? It was 14 years, and Barnabas and Titus went with him. What prompted him to go? What did he do there? A revelation prompted him, communicated to those of reputation at the gospel he preached among the Gentiles. Next, question 4. What did some who were secretly brought into this meeting try to get Paul to do? Did Paul submit to their command? And they tried to get him to circumcise Titus. And no, he did not submit to that plan. Number 5, how do you reconcile Paul's refusal to circumcise Titus with the fact that Paul later had Timothy circumcised? Well, circumcision of a Jewish Christian as a matter of expediency was permissible, but circumcision imposed upon a Gentile as an element necessary for salvation was out. No need. What did those who seemed to be something say to Paul? This is question number 6 in verse 6. They said nothing to Paul. What 2 things prompted them to extend the right hand fellowship to Paul and to Barnabas? And this is verses 7 through 9. When they saw that the gospel of the uncircumcised had been committed to Paul, just as the gospel to the circumcised had been committed to Peter. When James, Cephas, and John perceived the grace that had been given to Paul. Question number 8, what was the only thing they asked of Paul? That was verse 10, where they asked him to remember the poor. When Peter came to Antioch, why did Paul find it necessary to withstand him to his face? This is 11 and 12. Because he was willing to eat with Gentiles at first, but when certain men from James came, he withdrew himself out of fear. When Peter came to Antioch, why did Paul find it necessary to withstand him to his face? This is 11 and 12. because he was willing to eat with Gentiles at first, but when certain columns of certain men from James came, he withdrew himself out of fear. Who else was carried away by Peter's hypocrisy? Actually, the rest of the Jews, including Barnabas. Who else was carried away by Peter's hypocrisy? The rest of the Jews, including Barabbas. Briefly describe Paul's main argument as found in verse 16. That verse is, one is not justified by the works of the law, but by faith in Christ. So how did Paul live his life? Once he had died to the law, having been crucified with Christ, he lives by faith in the Son of God who followed. He loved him and gave himself for him. If righteousness comes through the law, what does it say about the death of Christ? That it was in vain if it came from the law. So that's chapter 2. We'll go on to chapter 3 next week, and I hope to see all of you here. Have a great evening. Bless you all. Thank you.